Hello, everyone. Just going to wait a few minutes. Welcome to all those that are here to this solutions workshop. Going to wait a couple of minutes to make sure everybody can get themselves accustomed to go to webinar, and then we'll get this show on the road. More and more people are coming in. So good to see. Okay, a couple more seconds, half a minute or so. Okay. Okay, everyone, let's get this show on the road. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the European Landowners Organisation workshop on insights from EU projects on co-designing research with rural actors. My name is Martin Fox. I am part of the projects team here at ELO, and I will be the moderator for this event. Our goal with this event is to gain insights from various EU-funded projects that the projects team has and will be working on to aid in collectively building a sustainable pathway forward to include rural actors. Today's Biodiversity Summit has shown that agriculture with biodiversity is a key asset, but can only be workable if all parties work together and can find common solutions. However, current policy instruments in place to hinder biodiversity losses across agricultural areas have proven to be ineffective. With that in mind, the EU Green Deal is spearheading a rethink of framing various sectors, especially food and agriculture. With this specific workshop, we attempt to aid this process in building bridges across solution insights from various EU-funded projects. First and foremost, some logistics. To our Portuguese listeners in the audience, please feel free to follow these instructions to obtain a live translation of what is taking place during this event. In the meantime, I would like to express my gratitude and appreciation to all of you for your presence. If you have any questions regarding technical difficulties or to ELO in general, please feel free to use the chat function, I don't know where it is for you, in your control panel, and our team will get back to you as fast as they can. This event will be lasting for roughly an hour, and without further ado, let's get it started. This is the structure of today's events. First, we will gather participant voices, which means you, the audience, through a Mentimeter poll. Second, we will be briefly presenting the 8 projects featured in this event, followed by the common themes that bridge these projects together. And finally, we will discuss these themes with our distinguished panelists. Now, moving to participant voices. We would very much like to hear your views, thoughts, and perspectives on the current state of biodiversity levels in Europe. Please go to menti.com, either on your phone, tablet, or computer, and enter the code below to start filling it out. This information will very much help us understand what your thoughts are and where you stand on current biodiversity strategies. This will also help us hit the ground running with our discussion section later on in this workshop. So if I could maybe wait a couple more seconds so you make sure I get the code right, or use the QR code. And if I could please see the Mentimeter. There we go. Okay, still waiting to see the Mentimeter. Ah, there we go. Okay, so the first question was, by how much do you think the global population of wild species has fallen over the last 40 years? Oh, wow. Oh, okay. So a lot of you have answered 60%. 60%, handful of you, 70%, and then even more, 40 and 50%. Wow, that's interesting that you would think that so much has fallen over the last 40 years. If we could please, more people coming into 50%, or tie break. Okay, thank you very much. If we can move on to the next question. What percentage of global food crop types rely on animal pollination to reproduce? That is an overwhelming thought on 70%. And with, okay, so some people thought 40, a little bit less 60. We'll wait a few seconds to see what the what more people think. Okay. Okay, we're starting to see a bit more. Aiming towards 40. Okay, perfect. That's good to see. It's interesting to see where all of you, most of you, stand on this issue. Moving on to the next question. Okay, so which actions should be prioritized in order to achieve biodiversity goals? Okay, so for this question, we really wanted you to rank which you thought would be top. Okay, so number 1, policy implementation, of course. Number 2, innovation integration. 3, field studies. 4, raising public. Oh, I see some movement. So more people are ranking them. So field studies are still taking the lead on raising public awareness. I think it's quite interesting that if we look at the last one, policy making and recommendation is 6, but then policy implementation is first. I find that quite interesting, that there's such a gap. Then innovation at the top, of course, we need more innovations. Policy implementation clearly taking the lead. We'll wait a couple more seconds. Okay. I think we can leave it as it is. So first place is policy implementation, second place, innovation integration, third, field studies, fourth, raising public awareness, fifth, research and development, and sixth, policy making and recommendations. Wow, this is quite interesting to see all of your perspectives on all of this, and we hope that this workshop will shed some light on policy implementation as well as any of the other 5. So without further ado, if we could also move on to the next question now. Okay, so name 3 key factors that you think could have the greatest benefit for restoring and maintaining biodiversity in Europe. Yes, so regenerative agriculture is at the top. Well, hoping you'd say something along those lines. Policy implementation as well, we're seeing a lot of policy here. I can see monitoring, sustainability assessment, introduce EU measures, agroecology as well. See others such as private land conservation, landowner support engaged. Yes, that has been very clear and very much emphasized over these past 2 days. Ooh. Policy implementations taking the lead again. Interesting one to see. Decrease in heavy transport as well. Stop cities expansion. Research in the fields. That's an interesting one. We're so happy that so many of you have been implementing your perspective and what you think should be prioritized. It's so interesting to hear that so many of you have different ideas, but that are also very much connected. I think I saw enlarge Natura 2000 sites. That's an interesting thing to say. Oh, wow. We're super happy to see all of this. Okay, thank you very much for all your input. We really appreciate this. And I think there's still another question afterwards. Yep, what types of projects related to biodiversity are you most interested in learning about? So hopefully, based on these answers, this workshop will be very interesting for you. Oh wow, number 1, soil biodiversity and climate change mitigation, followed by circular economy, and then sustainable agricultural practices, and then reversing the loss of wild pollinators. It's super close. No, as soon as I said that, of course, soil had to take the lead. Yep, circular economy taking up. These, of course, are very linked projects and themes. So as you will see later on, so hopefully we can, you will all be very, very happy with this workshop. Okay. Yeah, maybe wait a couple more seconds. Yeah, okay, and I think there's one, is there one more? Yep, so we reached the end, so if I could have presenter right again so that we can move on. Okay, now you should be seeing the, again, perfect. So thank you very much for your input. We actually found it to be rather interesting, and we hope that you can gather some insightful takeaways from today's events. And so now we're going to move on to the project that we'll be presenting today. So today we're going to be presenting 8 different projects that include a wide range of stakeholders across multiple levels throughout Europe. In alphabetical order, they are Bioplat, BioWill, Console, Microservices, Reflow, Safeguard, Soilguard, and Unisecker. To maintain a certain consistency across the projects, we'll be presenting both their respective general objectives as well as their projected expected results. First off, Bioplat, which stands for Promoting Sustainable Use of Underutilized Lands for Bioenergy Production through a web-based platform for Europe. The project aims to promote the uptake of bioenergy in European areas by creating a web-based platform that maps marginal, underutilized and contaminated, or MUC, lands for short, in both the EU and Ukraine by using strategies such as remote sensing, developing web GIS tools to conduct sustainability assessments, and to test such tools on 12 case studies to measure the variability of bioenergy value chains. Moving on to the next project, which is BioWill. So in today's age, to produce biopolymers and chemicals for widespread use, biorefineries actually use a linear production chain that focuses on food waste, forestry residue, and algae. Now, this is very unsustainable and produces significant amounts of waste. To provide an alternative, which means to create a zero waste circular production chain to achieve the same results, BioWill focuses on high value bioactive extractives, in this case, salicin from willow harvesting. Currently, there is no extractive-based cascade biorefinery within the EU. Therefore, an establishment of such a refinery presents significant economic potentials. So what would this circularity look like? Well, in BioWill's case, it would look something like this. Now, this here is the underpinning of the BioWill project. This circular production chain at a local level is the overarching objective of the project. Now, I will not go into detail about every single component, but there are 2 important takeaways that I really want you to focus on. First is the circularity of this production chain. Focus on its shape rather than its components at first. You can clearly see that within this circularity, everything feeds back into the circular system. Second, I'm now going to focus on the key products, which are the expected results of this project. They are marked in red, and the starting point, so the willow trees, are marked in green. By planting willow trees to then be harvested, salicin can be extracted from bark and pulp, allowing eco-food packages to be created. Once used, these packages are anaerobically digested to produce biomethane and digestives. The digestives are then in turn turned into biofertilizers, which are used to help spur the growth of willow trees, thus closing the loop. Moving on now to Console, which stands for Contract Solutions for Effective and Lasting Delivery of Agri-Environmental Climate Public Goods by EU Agriculture and Forestry. The general objectives of this project are to promote the delivery of agri-environmental climate public goods, or AECPGs for short, by both agriculture and forestry, boost innovation in the lasting delivery of these, and contribute to EU-related policies and instruments supporting both a competitive and sustainable primary bio-based sector. The main results of this project are to fund and develop agri-environmental models, improve economic viability of such models, and support policymakers and transdisciplinary research. All of this combined will hopefully help foster necessary contractual frameworks for farmers. Moving on now to microservices. whose goal is to predict climate change impacts on the crop microbiome and cascading effects on ecosystem services delivery in agroecosystems. As Europe experiences higher levels of warming and the northern migration of climate zones, food production becomes increasingly threatened. Soil biodiversity is crucial for ecosystem multifunctionality, but the potential to use microbial functions in sustainable agriculture have been largely understudied. With this in mind, the expected results of the project are to identify a network of wheat fields across sites across Europe with forecasted progression of climate change, to establish a field experiment to simulate drought conditions, to survey wheat rhizosphere microbial diversity, to employ machine learning to assess the validity of making predictions for soil biodiversity and ecosystem multifunctionality, and to promote strong collaboration among stakeholders. Now that we've presented the first half of the projects, if you do feel a bit lost, you can also read up on the projects in the project ID cards that can be found in your control panel. I don't know where your control panel is for each one of you. So make sure you go in there, take a look, and you'll be able to see more in detail the projects. Moving on to the next project, Reflow, which is the phosphorus recovery for fertilizers from dairy waste. Reflow aims to enable the sustainable expansion of the dairy industry by creating an innovative and entrepreneurial training environment for scientists, mitigate the environmental impact of dairy processing waste on soil and water, and support the technical, regulatory, and commercial development of the market for recycled phosphorus fertilizer products. This, hopefully, will have a positive impact on phosphorus recycling, European rural bioeconomy, EU policy goals, and land management practices across the board. Moving on to our next project, which is Safeguard, stands for Safeguarding European Wild Pollinators. From an overarching perspective, the project aims to reverse the loss of wild pollinators across Europe, all whilst increasing the understanding of socio-ecological systems. Through a multi-actor approach, Safeguard will inspire and facilitate the development of policy guidelines for wild pollinators, mitigate the causes of pollinator loss, and enable their mainstreaming into natural capital frameworks. Now, we move on to Soilguard, which stands for the Sustainable Soil Management to Unleash Soil Biodiversity Potential and Increase Environmental, Economic, and Social Well-being. The Soilguard project targets the promotion of sustainable soil management practices and increasing the perception of soil biodiversity as a key nature-based solution. The project will co-create a conceptual framework that will generate evidence needed to fill knowledge gaps associated with the project. In turn, this knowledge will then be shared on the Soil Guardians app, which in the long run will create a knowledge hub for all of its users. Finally, we move on to Unisecker, which is the understanding, the improving, and the sustainability of agroecological farming systems in the EU. Unisecker deals with the dilemma of food and biomass production and the preservation of ecosystem dynamics by focusing on agroecological approaches and eco-functional intensification. This strengthens the sustainability of European farming systems, contributes to food security, and enhances understanding of socioeconomic and policy barriers. In the long run, the project aims to improve methodological capacity and knowledge sharing, as well as proposing effective market mechanisms and policy instruments with the hope of being able to improve the knowledge base of agroecological farming in the EU. Now that we've presented the projects individually, it's time to bridge them. It's time to look at what connects them. As a team, we have come together and brainstormed on common themes that unite these 8 projects. After much work, we have come up with the following 4 themes. Bridging science and policy, as in work that aims to translate scientific research and outputs to aid policymakers in shaping more sustainable policy implementation strategies. Then research, which is self-explanatory. Moving on to cross-sectoral and multi-level approaches. By this, we mean looking at the problem at hand through a transdisciplinary lens, which is measuring and assessing how the work interacts in a complex and dynamic web amongst various sectors and actors across local, regional, national, and potentially even international levels. And land use change, which is also self-explanatory. Now let's see which project matches which with which theme. Bridging Science and Policy encompasses 7 of the 8 projects. Research 6. Cross-sectoral and multi-level approach 5. And land use change 4. Now here we must point out that these are very much overarching themes, and it is possible to relate every single project to every single one of these themes in one shape or another. However, for this workshop, we decided to focus specifically on the themes that the projects put at the very forefront of their project descriptions. But what about biodiversity? We are linked to the Biodiversity Summit that took place earlier today. So where does biodiversity fit in all of this? Let's look back at these projects. Although all projects are connected to biodiversity, there are 3 projects where biodiversity is very much a key and very much put in and with important measure that biodiversity is part of. These 3, Safeguard, Soilguard, and microservices. And this is a perfect segue into our next section, which is the discussion on how we can relate more of these projects back to biodiversity, and how together they can shape a more sustainable future where biodiversity restoration and maintenance is at the forefront of policymaking. With that in mind, it is my honor to introduce today's panel, which consists of members of each project. From Bioplat, we have Cosette from WIP Renewable Energies. From both BioWill and Reflow, we have JJ from the University of Limerick. From Consul, we have Davide from the University of Bologna. From Microservices, we have Martin from ETH Zurich. From Soilguard, we have Salva from the Leita Technological Center. From Safeguard, we have Ingolf from the University of Würzburg. And from Unisecker, we have Gerald from the Tunen Institute of Farm Economics. Distinguished panelists, it is a pleasure to have you here with us. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay. So if you could all turn on your cameras and then we can get this discussion going. Hello. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start this off with a very much a general question. Can each of you provide one solution, either unknown to the wider public or as emerging technologies that you have worked on throughout your projects that are available to support the development of sustainable, environmental friendly agriculture, and in the long term that could aid in restoring biodiversity levels? Cosette, would you like to start us off? And if you could please keep the response between 2 and 3 minutes, that goes for everybody. It'd be much appreciated. Cosette, the floor is yours.
Sure. First, I would like to say thank you for the presentation, for presenting all the projects, and hello to everybody. So actually in the Bioplat EU, we are more providing an opportunity rather than a solution. In this project, like, we are making use of abandoned, marginal, contaminated, underutilized land, all lands that are not being used for anything. And we are giving the opportunity to produce on these lands biomass for bioenergy production. We think that this is really a very sustainable solution because these lands are not used at the moment, and they could create, contribute to the EU climate targets and to the SDG goals, and at the same time they create an additional income to farmers and to landowners who have these lands and cannot profit from them. Additionally, such type of agriculture, let's say, is also could contribute to restore biodiversity. It's not, of course, we could not generalize, and it's not in all cases, but with previous projects, we had cases where we looked at biodiversity and it seems to have positive impacts. So I would say this from the experience of the Bioplat EU project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your very short but very insightful answer, because I think that might, if we look at in terms of land management and then we look at what maybe occurs underneath the land, I think that could link up well with Salva from Soilguard. So Salva, if you could please provide input from the Soilguard project.
First of all, Martin, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the presentation of all the projects. In the case of Soilguard, Soilguard is a brand new project. We are just starting. So it's always difficult when something is starting to speak about the solutions that we will bring to the world of agriculture, but at least I want to present our intentions. And our intentions in the case of when speaking about solutions and related to the potential of biodiversity to be used as a tool to improve resilience, adaptation, and in the end, economic resilience for the livelihood of farmers and all of these. I think that the big tool that Soilguard pretends to create is based on all the data that we are going to gather around Europe in different type of soils, different type of soil management, different type of crops. Try to understand what is the biodiversity there and how the challenges related to climate change and management are affecting this biodiversity. With this information, and always taking into account the opinion of farmers through a big network of knowledge that we want to create within the project. This will be key, because science without the opinion of farmers in this case will be a little bit isolated, where we pretend to create a tool based on artificial intelligence and try to bring all this data together to give to farmers and other type of stakeholders, also policymakers and so on, that how they would like to change the management of their soils and how this would affect biodiversity and how they will boost biodiversity activity and how this can help them to manage better and more sustainably their soils in different types of conditions and future challenges. So this is the idea, to create a tool that can be really used and accepted by farmers, because this is a challenge sometimes that farmers use really this type of tools, and we want to involve them in the creation of this tool to really unleash the potential of biodiversity for their own benefit and for the benefit of the, in the end, sustainability in Europe.
Thank you very much, Salva, for that answer. I understand that Soilguard hasn't started yet, but it's as important to look into the future as to look into the past in terms of seeing what has been done and how we can help for the future. If I look into other projects that haven't started yet, off the top of my head, I can also think of Safeguard. So Ingo, could you please provide your input on this issue as well?
Yeah, thanks for the really nice overview and the interesting workshop. So yes, Safeguard also hasn't yet started, but of course we have some solutions in mind from past research and projects. And if you're asking for less common solutions for agriculture, I think it's related to landscapes. So our past research demonstrates that not only the local management of a field or farm, but the composition of landscapes and the integration of activities of many farmers is creating a certain structure of landscapes, the diversity of crops and crop rotations, the implementation of agri-environmental schemes that benefit diversity and also ecosystem services. So one solution that is little exploited so far would be to build farmer communities, cooperatives that work together in managing landscapes in a biodiversity friendly way. And I think that is something that is less well emphasized, to my opinion.
Yeah, very interesting perspective, Ingolf. Thank you very much for providing that. It is important to see that it is important to bring agricultures together and farmers together, because we all need each other. So I think that actually links well, that could potentially link well to Davida's project of Console. So Davida, could you please provide your input on this?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and the nice presentation, and also the opportunity to discuss these topics here. Indeed, in Console, what we are doing is to try to develop solutions, meaning with solution, basically innovative types of contract that can help farmers to produce different kinds of public goods, including biodiversity. And one of the typology we are actually investigating are collective contracts and solution, which indeed fit very well with the kind of instruments that were mentioned before. And in addition, we are putting a lot of focus on result-based solution, which means situations where payments are awarded to farmers based on the kind of results they achieve. For example, increase in species richness, or in the degree some landscape elements are preserved. And as well, contracts related to remuneration to farmers coming from the value chain. Again, for example, with consumers paying for products with higher benefits to biodiversity. And at the moment, we are in the middle of the project. We had a collection of case studies where we found about 60 cases in Europe that are now showcased on our project website. And we actually promise to go on with more innovative solutions in the future, but I think I should stop now.
Thank you very much, David. Yes, it is interesting that that Console is at the halfway point, is that you focus more on results and in terms of value chain. And I think if we think about results and value chain, I think BioWell is very much well placed in that as an innovative way, that the results in terms of the products that it possesses, as well as an alternative value chain to contemporary ones. So JJ, could you please provide input for BioWell? Because maybe for Reflow we'll come back later.
Sure. Okay. So BioWell it's the concept here is that it's a zero waste biorefinery, and the idea was that for small and medium-sized farms, we could provide farmers with an alternative income stream to livestock rearing. And so we are choosing. So the idea here is we would grow a crop, in this case willow, on marginal land, at least in Ireland. The soils we're choosing are the land we're choosing is marginal. And the key to any biorefinery is that we have some very, very high value, potentially high value byproducts. So the idea here is we're growing specifically willow crops which are not native to Northwest Europe, and we're growing them for their salicin content. Salicin is a natural analgesic, and if the European Medicines Agency allows topical formulations to contain up to 5% salicins without the products having to undergo clinical trials. So there's an easy route to market. So once we've extracted the salicin, the remainder of the material we're going to use for the production of catering products. So we're making the equivalent of cardboard cups, cardboard forks. So these types of products. So we're displacing plastic from the catering industry. And at the end of these products' life cycle, we're then going to put them into anaerobic digesters. We're going to produce biomethane, and the residue, the AD digestate, we're characterizing both in terms of its nutrient value. So when it goes back onto the soil, it will have a nutrient value, but we're also going to measure its recalcitrance once we put it into the soil, because digestate, most of the reactive carbon, has already gone to the production of methane. So what remains is a relatively recalcitrant form of carbon. So this should exist within this. Once this goes into the soil, it should remain there as a carbon storage reservoir. So that's basically, we're very much an interdisciplinary project, and it involves farmers, it involves technologists, it involves medical people. So it's interdisciplinary, and I think hopefully will be of significant benefit to the sustainability of the agricultural sector in the long term.
Okay. Thank you very much for that short, concise answer to quite a complex topic, actually. And I think it's great that you focused on the services that bio products can provide as an alternative to modern day norms that we see. And I think in terms of services, that's a perfect segue into microservices. So Martin, if you could please provide your inputs from the microservices project.
Yes, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, so thanks for having me. So microservices is all about microorganisms and biodiversity of microorganisms. And the thing is, if we want to conserve or even promote biodiversity, we obviously need to know what it is. And with microbes, this is not so straightforward. So microbial diversity, in particular in soil, is mind-blowing. We have around, I would say, 10 quadrillion of microbes in just 1 ton of soil, and consisting of millions of different species. And so therefore understanding this biodiversity is actually quite a challenge. And in particular, techniques for a long time have been rather limited. So with basically just culturing microbes and study their physiology in the lab, we're only able to basically look at around 1% of this diversity. So when it comes to solutions, it's basically novel genetic technologies such as DNA sequencing or metagenomics that we now apply also within that project, but also in other projects, technologies that have completely changed our view on microbial diversity. And with this, we gain now a much better understanding of what this biodiversity is when it comes to microbes, and also try to better understand basically how these microbes function and in the end deliver ecosystem services to agriculture systems. So bottom line, only if we know what is there and what they can do, we can identify or start identifying agriculture practices that conserve or promote this biodiversity in the long run. And microservices in that respect aims at also basically predicting how, on one hand, agriculture management practices, but also future climatic conditions will influence this diversity and this functioning that's related to this biodiversity.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's so interesting to hear about such a relatively new field of study and how potentially it can be used for sustainability in the agriculture sector, which I think that microservices focus on knowledge sharing as well as improve a knowledge base of a completely new sector goes hand in hand with the Unisecker project of Gerald. So with the aims of the Unisecker project. So Gerald, could you please perhaps elaborate on the Unisecker project?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Martin, both for the invitation as well as the introduction with the overview of the presentation, and also now the very smooth bridge you built to Unisecker. Well done. Yeah, I think actually that's a really important point. It's about knowledge sharing, and the term understanding in the title of Unisecker is really critical. So we looked at agroecological practices, and we did this in case studies in a set of real farms in 15 European countries, and basically assessed how the sustainability performance of those farms change if different practices, agroecological practices, are implemented. And in parallel, we set up and run multi-actor platforms where we brought together different actors, farmers, advisors, value chain actors, policymakers, and so on, and really to co-construct solutions on how to address the different barriers and drivers and how to foster the implementation of those practices. So the knowledge sharing and the knowledge creation is really a central point there. I think in terms of your question on practices or technologies, I think it's really different combinations and different local contexts that make a difference. But I think if you would ask me for an overarching headline, then I think in terms of biodiversity, one of the things stands out is the different practice in relation to diversification. Be it in terms of diversifying production systems, rotations, intercropping, etc., that had, at least on our example farms, quite a positive impact on biodiversity. That stand out. But I think in addition to that, and just one brief sentence, then I stop. it's not only about the technology, I think, in terms of Unisecker, it's about the social, the governance, innovation when it comes to knowledge networks and the different forms of cooperation that really are important and that also have really a positive impact on biodiversity and all the other public goods, as well as the value added and the value chain aspects that are related to that. And with that, I stop. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you very much, Gerald, for that in-depth insight into Unisecker. And I think if we talk about social impacts, if we talk about multi-actors, if we talk about transdisciplinary, that leads us perfectly to Reflow, which last but not least is the last one to be presented. So JJ, since you are part of both BioWill and Reflow,
okay,
please take it away.
So I guess with Reflow, the context for Reflow is phosphorus and the dairy industry. So the dairy industry is one of the biggest sources of pollution within the European Union. So Reflow is it's a Marie Curie ITN, and we're focused on the dairy processing industry. So we're looking at dairy factories and looking at their wastewater treatment processes in order to recover phosphorus. So the idea here is that depending on the size of your dairy and depending on where it's located, we're developing a number of technological solutions. So first and foremost, we're trying to eliminate the use of heavy metals in wastewater treatment. So no alum and no iron in your wastewater treatment processing. So we're looking at microbial solutions for the recovery of phosphorus. And the initial fertilizer could be a completely organic material. So it would be a dried sludge from your phosphorus rich, but nitrogen rich as well, sludge from your dairy factory. But we're then looking at other options for further processing of this, which will have to be done at different scales, and the higher the extent to which you process, to some extent, will determine its value. So we're looking at options, for instance, of recovering struvite or phosphoric acid-based fertilizers such as mono or diphosphate. We're looking at the recovery of hydrochars, and we're looking at the recovery of other forms of inorganic fertilizers. We're then going to put these, where we're doing this currently, we're putting these onto soil. And a bit like Martin, we're looking at the soil, how these different forms of fertilizers affect the soil microbial communities, and then how they affect both the phosphorus cycle and the nitrogen cycle within the soil, because these are responsible to a large extent for greenhouse gas emissions. So we have actors which are both chemical engineers, biochemical engineers, horticulturalists, microbiologists, but in addition to that, and very, very importantly, we also have economists and people involved in life cycle analysis. Because one of the other things we want to develop, we're developing an app for farmers, because if you want farmers to move from a mineral-based fertilizer to an organic fertilizer, then they need to know if I use if I replace my fertilizer with a biofertilizer, how much do I need to put on my soil per hectare in order to get the equivalent growth? And very, very important to all of this is the value chain, because with a lot of modern agriculture, including the dairy industry, through amalgamations over the last 20 or 30 years, the industry has gone from being cooperatively based to being PLCs, which meant from the farming context, the value has migrated upwards and out of the pockets of the farmer. So in order to make the farming sustainable, we're looking at different economic models. And I'm going to be quiet now because Mark is going to cut me off if I don't. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you
very
all.
multidisciplinary.
Thank you, JJ. Thank you very much for all your insights. So now I'm going to ask a question to each and every one of you more specifically about your projects. And so we're going to start with Martin from Microservices. So as well, within 2 to 3 minutes, can you please elaborate on how does a better understanding of soil microbial diversity contribute to sustainable and climate resilient agriculture?
So we come back to the microbes. And so although basically unseen to our naked eye, microorganisms drive virtually every natural biogeochemical cycle on Earth. So they are key for functioning of every ecosystem, including agricultural systems, because, for example, they regulate nutrient cycling, they improve plant growth and stress tolerance, they help defending against pests and diseases, they break down pollutants such as pesticides, And as mentioned before by JJ, they also are important for greenhouse gas fluxes, and therefore they influence the climate. So therefore, we need to basically understand how agricultural practices, but also the future climate, will basically impact this biodiversity. And so to better understand basically how we can harness this biodiversity optimally to improve crop production. Because, I mean, there are concerns that high intensity farming systems, as we have it now with a lot of chemical inputs, they kind of impoverish this diversity. And so that basically a potential loss in microbial diversity and their functions might become a problem, even more so under future climatic conditions. And so with basically having this in mind, microservices aims at basically better understanding and then also predicting how future climatic conditions will influence this diversity, and elucidate basically how management practices, different ones, basically are promoting this diversity and also are making systems more climate resilient in that aspect.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin, for that very concise and understandable answer. So now I'm going to move on to Cosette from Bioplat. So Cosette, could you please elaborate on the very concept behind Bioplat contributes to reducing indirect impacts of bioenergy deployments by targeting marginal, underutilized and contaminated lands in the EU. Could you please elaborate on this project further and bioenergy deployment?
Yes. Well, as you may know, the bioenergy in general is not very well perceived and made by the public and by, you know, the non-experts people. But it is thought that to be unsustainable because of the competition between food and feed on the land. And this is where the importance of the Bioplat EU comes, because in this project, the focus is on using marginal, contaminated and underutilized lands for biomass production for bioenergy purposes. So this debate no longer exists, and we cannot say that it is still 100% sustainable for sure, because we need to look into different indicators and different sustainability indicators, and most importantly also economic ones. So in the Bioplat EU project, we are promoting the concept by building up a tool that will help stakeholders to map to see where in Europe underutilized, marginal and contaminated lands exist, and to what can be grown on these lands, and to conduct a sustainability assessment to see whether it is economically feasible, whether it's sustainable, how much is this to emissions, and all these things. And this, we think that it enables, it gives a first insight about the feasibility of a value chain, and it could enhance the promotion and the implementation of bioenergy projects on such lands. So this is in a summary what's the target and how it contributes to reducing the indirect impact of bioenergy deployment and in increasing the deployment of bioenergy production, especially on these unused lands, let's say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cosette, for that insight on Bioplat and how it manages MUC lands. I'm going to move on now back to JJ. So JJ, put on the BioWheel hat for a sec. So the BioWheel circularity that we showcased earlier showcases that zero waste production chains are feasible. What do you see as the next step to integrate such a framework on a regional and potentially even a national scale?
I think that one of the things that is really important here is the demonstration, as Cosette called it, of value chain. And I think we must, if we want to convince farmers that there are more sustainable options out there, something must be in their pocket, you know, because they need to see some. They can't become poorer because of this. So in terms of BioWheel, what I would really like to see implemented is the EU already has a framework in place to allow carbon storage within soils. But I think they have to move quicker in terms of the policy implementation to make this happen. So we must have very clear, auditable measures of carbon sequestration within the soil, because I think this will encourage farmers to move away from current farming practices to something which will be of benefit to the soil, because soil health is key to all of this, which will be of benefit to the soil, but which will also not impoverish the farmers as they move to the more sustainable options.
Thank you very much, JJ, for that very clear answer about how the bio circularity can be taken to the next level. I'm gonna keep the eye on you, JJ, and this time for Reflow. So thinking back, the Reflow project emphasizes a lot of technological and socio-economic components in order to best fit within European rural bioeconomy. This highlights the importance of framing human-nature interactions to best build sustainable policy. What other strategies do you think can be used to attract the eyes of policy and decision makers to the Reflow project or other projects focusing on sustainable innovation integration?
One of the, I think key to all of these is implementation. And a key mechanism for implementing these policies is what the EU refers to as market activation instruments. So that basically means obligation. So currently, in order to encourage the development of technologies to replace liquid fuels for internal combustion engines, bioethanol and biodiesel, and now we have these advanced biofuels, the EU has imposed obligations on the petroleum refiners. And the same has to happen for the fertilizer industry. So that there must be an obligation for all fertilizers going onto land to use a certain defined quantity of recycled nutrients, because this will encourage both circularity, but by a lot of these recycled nutrients will be carbon-rich materials. And when these go onto the soil, these will encourage the promotion of good soil health. So I think market activation instruments are key to any successful implementation.
Okay, thank you very much, JJ, for that quick and fast insight on both those projects. Now moving on to stay within our timing constraints, Salva from Soilguard. You've emphasized that Soilguard is about to start, but in terms of now, what steps or urgent actions should be taken to mainstream sustainable soil management practices and the perception of soil biodiversity as a key nature-based solution to face both land degradation and climate change stresses? What can we do now?
So I think that, as Martin was saying, and also JJ, then in our case, it's all about new knowledge, because we know we don't know a lot about the microbial and other organisms, biodiversity in soil. So we need to create the knowledge to understand the real status of biodiversity nowadays around Europe. So it's not the same, probably, the status of soil biodiversity in Sweden, that in Portugal, that in Austria. So we need to understand region-specific differences of all of these relations of different type of management, because in the end, if the farm to fork strategy is pushing for a 25% of organic management in the next years, we need also to understand if this organic management is better or not for soil biodiversity. Theoretically, we think that yes, it's going to be better, but we need to number this. We need to quantify this in the different species, in the different type of organisms, how they relate in each other, because microbes, fungi, arthropods, they create networks, and it's not the same to focus on one particular taxa that try to take a look to all of it, all the connections, and how they affect to a huge variety of ecosystem services. So first of all, we need to understand the status to then say, okay, yes, this type of management is enhancing biodiversity And this biodiversity is really related to better productivity, increase of carbon storage in soils, increase of nutrient flows, etc., etc. So this is the first step that we need to do. And once we have this knowledge, then always taking into account that I think that the farmer should be in the center of all of this. So we need to always communicate and have feedback from them. And then with this knowledge and with this evidence, try to go to other type of stakeholders who creates new policy. Because in our case, it's not so policy implementation. In our case, we need new policy because soil biodiversity is really underrepresented in policy. We don't have policy saying, okay, let's do this and promote a 50% increase in the ecosystem services derived from soil biodiversity. Something like this doesn't exist. So we need to put soil biodiversity in policy at European level or at other levels. And then with this, we can really boost the role of biodiversity as a nature-based solutions.
Okay, thank you very much, Salva. I think if in terms of understanding and raising a knowledge base, and also in terms of steps to take and start, is actually a perfect lead up into our question targeted at Gerald from Unisecker. So Gerald, now that the Unisecker project has actually been completed, how do you envision the agroecological hubs helping farmers and landowners learn about both biodiversity and agroecological transitions?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Well, I think what we are trying to do with the hub is basically to filter and translate all the results into results that are easily understandable for the different target groups. And one of the key target group, of course, the farmers. And maybe just to pick one element here is that we were looking for ways of really also engaging our different actors that we had in the multi-actor platforms, also in how we basically transmit and disseminate the results. So what we created are story maps that are accessible to farmers, where we show in a visual, easily understandable way also kind of key messages from the farmers, from the different actors on their experiences in the implementation and the problems and solutions for implementing agroecological practices. And I think that's one of the key elements I think really to highlight. It's the practical experience, the peer-to-peer experiences that can be helpful here, and that covers quite a range of different farming systems, from small scale dairy and cheese producers in Lithuania or small scale farming in Romania, to really market-oriented farming in Germany. So that there are quite a range of different farming systems and different experiences that we can share there. And it's with those multi-actor platforms, the knowledge that we have created there is that we are going to maintain those platforms and basically continue the exchange with the actors involved, and involve, for example, the advisors and farmers also then in further events and disseminating the knowledge that we have jointly created. So it's a little bit about the ownership as well, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gerald. Sorry if I'm rushing this a bit, but we're almost out of time. So moving on now to Ingolf from Safeguard. So also, Safeguard is one of the projects that hasn't started yet, but the project intends to strengthen pollinator-relevant policy and decision-making. Although the project hasn't started yet, we know that pollinators are declining rapidly. Are there any suggestions you'd like to give policymakers today rather than a few years from now?
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Yes, so we are all aware that we have a decline in pollinator diversity, but also strong evidence for broader insect diversity decline across Europe. And there's also evidence that the steepest declines occur in agricultural landscapes, and that the current level of environmental schemes is not sufficient to reverse this decline. So the urgent need for policy is to to implement new schemes and new policy frameworks to really reverse this diversity decline, because it's pollinators that are important for crop pollination services, but many wild pollinators are also essential for wild plant reproduction and conservation. So these are cascading long-term negative consequences for diversity that we recognize, but we currently we have no proper measures to reverse this decline, and so that's an urgent need for policy to take action very soon.
Okay, thank you very much, Ingolf. And now for our last question, last but not least, for Davida from Consol. How do you see and how does the promotion of agri-environmental climate public goods, or AECPGs, through contractual solutions aid the agriculture and forestry sector to help biodiversity?
Yeah, well, when we think at contract solutions, what we mean is basically a set of potential different ways agreement among actors may be formalized. And the interesting thing is that when you look at this issue through contract studies, you become aware of the huge variety and the huge menu of different mechanisms you can have in place. And I think on the one hand, this makes things complicated, but on the other hand, it allows actually to address explicitly the needs of different actors. And I think one key point here is that contracts can better help in accounting for the diversity and heterogeneity of farmers and farming systems in relation to the contribution that can give to biodiversity. And besides this, contract analysis can also help better understanding the connection between farmers and other actors. And I think primarily one of the future issues is the connection with consumers, as well as citizens through NGOs and similar institutions.
Okay, thank you very much. So those are the 8 questions that we have asked. That's fortunately the end of the discussion section. So if I could please have presenter or panelists. Oh wait, I think I still can. Yes, I still can. Can you all see this? Yep, so unfortunately we have run out of time, and we would very much like to thank you all for attending this event. We hope that you have found it insightful, learned a thing or two, and are now able to look at current sustainable policymaking initiatives through the lens of biodiversity. We would also like to thank our distinguished panelists for agreeing to join us today and engage in a fruitful discussion, as well as to thank the Forum for the Future of Agriculture and the European Landowners Organization for letting us take part in this trio event. Finally, we would like to thank the team behind the scenes working on technicalities and logistics. You will be able to find the recording of this event on YouTube, so stay tuned on our social media accounts. In the coming weeks, just in terms of plugging in some future events, we have the live event on June 7th from 3 to 5. And if you want to connect to Natura 2000 land managers, or you just have an interest in conservation, be sure to download the eNatura 2000 app for free, available on both the App Store and the Google Play Store. One of the key topics on this app is in fact biodiversity. So through the app, you can keep up to date on all the latest webinars. And here are some of the other projects that the projects team at ELO is currently working on. And with that, we wish you all a lovely afternoon ahead. Thank you for joining, and bye-bye. And with
Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that being said, we kindly ask if all the speakers could stay on for 1 second so that we do the traditional screenshot at the end. So since you all have your cameras on, I'm going to do this. So if you could all just smile, I'm going to count down from 3, 2, 1, and then if you could all just smile, that'd be grand. So 3, 2, 1, smile. Perfect. Thank you very much for coming. We appreciate your presence here. Thank you very much for providing us with valuable insight on your projects. Each project can be found through the European Landowners website at europeanlandowners.org, and that'll link you to the relevant social media website accounts.